you. I want to talk about four things today. First is the transformation of Quaker testimony in the last 120 years. The second thing is about the inward and outward experience of Quaker testimony. Those things are one and the same, but we can't only look at testimony as what we do as individuals or as a meeting, but also our experience of the testimonies in worship and in our lives. I'll speak very briefly about particular Quaker testimonies, emphasizing examples from our yearly meeting. And then lastly, I'll address the question of continuing revelation and the future of Quaker testimony. 118 years ago in Philadelphia, there was a friend who was also president of Haverford College who talked about how Quaker testimonies evolved. Isaac Sharpless said, the testimonies which our ancestors upheld may be in part replaced by others more vital to our day. But those among us who see beneath the surface will feel no disposition to build on any other groundwork than theirs. And so I bring this forward to show an awareness that the older way of talking about testimony wasn't working for Friends, and something new was needed. And I'll talk about what that was. Many of us identify the short list of Quaker testimonies with Howard Brinton, who at mid-20th century introduced them in a series of books, first for school administrators, and then in a pamphlet, and then finally in a book at the 300th anniversary of Quakers. And the Scattergood Friends School in Iowa, which reopened as a multiracial Friends School after having been a refugee hostel, was the first school to adopt a short list of testimonies as their guiding principles. And many schools, or even most Quaker schools, have done that in the years since. I'm going to share this with you later, but here are some reasons why a new short list of Quaker testimonies emerged in the middle of the 20th century. Many new independent monthly meetings, which weren't part of yearly meetings, like Friends Meeting of Washington or Cambridge Meeting in Massachusetts. Many newly convinced friends, the reunification of yearly meetings, including our own, the need for a simplified message as Quaker schools were incorporating more and more non-Quaker families into their communities, and finally the new global attention Quaker service was getting, especially after Friends, the AFSC and its British partner and Canadian partner won the Nobel Peace Prize. I want to say briefly about the shift in testimony by using the peace testimony as an example. So how is the peace testimony both 102 and 362 years old? The reason why is that in 1920, Friends renewed the peace testimony, shifting it from a testimony against war into a positive, affirmative testimony that had a broad concept of peace. And there's some examples there of how that happens. The scholarship around this shift is Elaine, who is the former clerk of Canadian Yearly Meeting, and Jisuk, who's a Korean Quaker, and they wrote 3 years ago an excellent article about this in the Cambridge Companion to Quakerism. Briefly, I just want to say how the Quaker testimonies that we now use were reflected in our discipline practice, which discipline didn't usually end in disownment, but the best records are about those where a disownment occurred. And here are some examples. Moving beyond this history, I want to speak about the inward and outward experience of Quaker testimony. And this is the core of what I want to present to you today. If you take nothing else away, these next few slides are the most important parts. And I hope you return to this over the next months. Friends, I challenge you to consider that each of our testimonies has both an inward and an outward aspect to it. And this does not mean that we're making we're walking the talk, or we're practicing what we preach. Those are things that other people in the world do. But instead, what Quakers do, in my understanding, is we try to align our outward practice with our inward experience, especially the experience we have of the divine in our lives, and especially in worship. And so this is a list of 7 Quaker testimonies emphasizing both the inward and the outward aspects of those testimonies. So for example, the inward experience of that of God in every person is the inward truth from which we are not deciding to practice equality or equity. It is what compels us to practice equity in our lives and in our communities and in our world. In the same way, the sacredness of creation and our deep experience of that compels us to practice earth care and stewardship for the earth. So that's different than saying walk the talk or practice what you preach. Instead, that's about our experience of inward truth. And in this chart, it looks as if these are sort of a binary, a dualistic frame, and I experimented with a different way of arranging them, a word cloud, with the divine presence in the center, the inward experience of testimony in the inner circle, and the outer practice of Quaker testimony in the outer circle. And this is a way of helping us to visualize Quaker testimony not as a dualistic thing between inward and outward, but as one whole practice. Another way of thinking of that is a constant movement between inward truth and outward practice in our individual lives and in our communities. And especially in our communities, or even within our yearly meeting, we often have times in our lives or friends within our meetings who have a more contemplative experience of Quakerism, emphasizing the inward truth. And they are essential to our communities. And we have other friends who are very dynamic and focused on the outward practice. And those two groups of friends, or within the yearly meetings that practice more contemplative approach and those which are more outwardly engaged, we need each other because that's how our testimony is whole. And I'm giving some examples for each of 7 testimonies here. And I'll encourage you in a spirit of worship sharing to read these together. But these are examples of how one moves from the inward to the outward. So the inward peace I experience in the divine leads me to engage in reconciliation and peacemaking. The deep experience of steadfast love, of the divine steadfast love, leads me to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. And the same way, we can move from outward practice to inward experience. So in seeking fairness and equity, I more fully know that of God in every person. In community and fellowship, I am more deeply feel unity in the divine presence. In the workshops I lead at yearly meeting, I often have people join together in reading these with a lot of silence between each one so we can absorb them. I don't think we have time for that today, so I'm only introducing this to you as a resource. And this is just what I've learned from friends over the last several years, and I'm offering it as a way for you to consider how you can integrate your inward experience and your outward practice of Quaker testimony. This is how we move beyond a rather shallow understanding of Quaker spices as just a list of nearly secular values into a more truly Quaker practice of Quaker testimony. Here is a definition of testimony offered by a friend from Cincinnati, Paul Buckley. And it highlights 5 elements of Quaker testimony. It's not individual, but it's shared by community. It's something we testify to publicly. It's not just a personal matter. It's a leading from God. It doesn't come from our logic or personal preference. Testimony is a cross to conscience, taking us outside of our comfort zone and challenging our conscience and the consciences of others. And finally, testimony flows from a place of love, divine love and our own love. I'm going to speak a little bit about particular Quaker testimonies, knowing that you're going in depth in those in the coming months. Here are some examples of the way that simplicity testimony has emerged over the last century, highlighting with the yellow highlight there the work of a friend, Agnes Saylor, who I believe ended her life was in their last years at Sandy Spring Friends Home. But in the mid 70s, after she had earlier in her life, she had been the principal of the first school in Virginia that had been desegregated. And then she was a peace activist, and she was the clerk. Agnes Saylor was the clerk of BYM Peace Committee during the Vietnam War. But in the 1970s, she turned to an emphasis on simplicity and ecology, and she distributed this bumper sticker, which became like a meme in the 70s and 80s. Maybe some of you remember it. Mm-hmm. Here's some examples of the integrity testimony, which has also sometimes been called the honesty, or in Britain, it's called the truth testimony. I want to highlight 2 things. I want to just highlight that a group of women from Homewood Meeting 70 years ago refused to sign Maryland's loyalty oath. And here are some of their pictures. Maybe some of you knew these friends, like Vera Shank, for example. And many of them lost their jobs. And after 18 years, they finally won their case before the Supreme Court. The community testimony, we have many rich examples. We sometimes practice a worship sharing format called Friendly Eights. Maybe many of you know. I've learned that seems to have been originated by Ted Matthias of Sandy Spring Meeting. 58 years ago. That's just one example of specific application of the community testimony in Sandy Spring history. And Barry Morley's involvement with the camping program is very much in that spirit. The last one from Gunpowder Meeting, a friend named Irving Matthews, for nearly 2 decades, a mid-20th century Gunpowder Meeting, one of our oldest meetings in Baltimore Yearly Meeting, dwindled down to one family, which meant that often on Sunday in meeting for worship, there was only 2 or even just 1 person there in the 1940s and 50s. And now Gunpowder Meeting has been reborn through that effort to maintain community of Irving Matthews and his family. And it's now a vibrant meeting with many members and much activity. Here are some examples of the equality or equity testimony in practice. I could do this whole workshop just on this one testimony. It's the most fascinating and complex and in some ways troubling testimony for Friends. For example, here's an example from 200 years ago of one of our BYM yearly meetings, Deer Creek meeting, where soon after ending Quaker slaveholding, they established a practice of segregated seating in their meeting in 1787 after a 21-month discernment process. And one of the Black youth in Darlington, Maryland, Cupid Paca, later, who may have been there participating in the Quaker meeting or surely knew about it, later started an AME church in that town, partly through the hard-heartedness of Quakers in not allowing the full participation of Black friends and in their meeting. Some people consider the stewardship or earth care testimony to be a new testimony, but we can see examples of that testimony all the way back to 1681 when forest conservation was included in the charter for Pennsylvania. In Baltimore Yearly Meeting, many friends, including Janie Wilson and Steve Elkington and others, helped to launch a Friends in Unity with Nature concern, which has really grown into our earth care stewardship testimony over the last years, recognized as by Britain Yearly Meeting as the sustainability testimony. I just want to say a little bit about continuing revelation in the future of Quaker testimony. Over the last century, individual testimonies have come into periods of emphasis. The peace testimony in many respects dominated our Quaker testimony from 1920 till 1980. And one of the good things about the spices concept is it's helped us to look at testimony more broadly beyond just the peace testimony. So the question I ask you, what's next? I would suggest that what's next, one thing is a Quaker testimony of justice that we're already practicing and in fact has been part and parcel of Quaker practice for many centuries. And here are some examples of it. And you can see in this list many of the things that Friends have done and are doing right up to the present. We tend to think of these as particular concerns, but they're in fact, to me, one part of a whole justice testimony. And I challenge you in the next months to have a session focused on the justice testimony. Um, that's the main. I want to go into discussion, but I just want to introduce. I'm going to send you this 30-slide resource for you and show you that all of the Quaker testimonies have their origin in Quakers' reading of the Bible. Here's some examples from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Here's some from the Gospels. Here's some from the rest of the New Testament. And then here's some examples. I could only fit 4 testimonies on this page of in the writings of friends over the last centuries. So I'm going to stop my screen share and let's have just a minute of silence and then reflections or questions or corrections. I want to learn from you and hear what I may have not done as well as I could have or could do much better.
So thank you, Jim, for this.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
I hear you fine. Thank you.
Yeah. So we are eager, I think, at Sandy Spring to get from this time of hunkering down and internal work during the pandemic, internal focus, to get out into the community more. And over at Friend's house, as I was talking to you, when we try to tell others what our Quaker faith and practice is, we seem to rely on this spice idea as a way of describing who we are. So I'm wondering, from your experience in the last couple of years, how would you recommend that how do we describe ourselves in the outside world to people who are coming to Quakers, coming to our meeting, interested in us, curious? What would be your approach?
I think every individual friend needs to do that in a way that is meaningful and is true for themselves. And I feel like the spices list has had a useful element in education and often in introducing Quakerism to newcomers since about the mid-90s, when it probably began in an elementary school, in the Quaker elementary school in Philadelphia area. I think it's probably time for us to talk about a short list of testimonies, but leave spices behind. But that may be a decade in evolving toward that. I do think that Quaker testimony is at the center of what we do, and is important in conversations with newcomers. But our experience of worship may be what we, depending on the person, we may speak about that first. And then in the way I'm presenting here, show how the inward experience of worship leads us outwardly into testimony, into practicing testimonies, and into a kind of faith into practice. So I'm not sure that's a little bit different question than what I'm presenting in this workshop. But I would hope that if Sandy Spring meeting, by the end of this 6-month program that you're engaged in, all of you will be prepared better to answer that question in a way that's true for yourselves.
Thank you.
Jim, I just wanted to respond briefly, if that's okay.
Oh, please do, Nikki.
So Trenton Friends had a similar question about how we share our Quaker faith and testimony to the world, and it took a while. It took some inward introspection, and we finally decided to just open the doors and go outside. So now we have an actual larger community presence, to the point where we invested $100,000 in the community over the last 4 years, and just small grassroots groups. They use our meeting house. We just support things in the community, and we show our faith by believing in the community. And we don't expect them to come on Sundays, but sometimes they walk in and sit down, and that's just fine. Sometimes Black Lives Matters, they come and use our kitchen and prepare meals and distribute it to the community. So just try thinking outside of the box a bit.
I can't read her name.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm here to support Jim. And we were supposed to give this talk at FGC this year, but our proposal didn't get selected. So
We'll find a time to do it in the future.
Yes.
Perhaps at Pendle Hill or but thank you so much for being here to support this, Nikki.
Yep.
So Nikki, I'm in the meeting house and I can't read your name and see where you're from because it's blurry. Could you tell us, please?
So my name is Nikki Mossgrove. I'm from Trenton Monthly Meeting, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting.
Thank you.
I'm rising clerk this year, so hold me in light.
I'm
for the yearly meeting.
Okay.
Jim, I'm really, I have a comment to make, but first I want to say something to Nikki. Nikki, I used to live about 11 miles from where you are, and it's a pleasure to see you and hear about Trenton meeting again. I'm really fascinated by the history that you've presented, Jim, that I'm very familiar because I've given presentations about the long ago history of Quakerism when it first began, but the whole middle, I don't know, from say 1700 to now, never had a structure for me in my brain. And now it does. And it's very useful to my thinking to see us as people who have changed dramatically and moved from one position to another as life around us has changed. And I thank you for that.
I also want to thank you, Jim. And I wanted to return to an idea that you started out with, which was that some of us oldsters have a slight aversion to the spice concept. So I was raised in Florida Avenue Meeting and then kind of drifted away, came back as an adult to Sandy Spring and applied for membership in Sandy Spring. My dad was a longtime member of Florida Avenue Meeting. And when I told him I was applying for membership, he said, okay, here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to read. And he gave me Howard Brinton's Guide to Quaker Practice and the longer book of, Friends for however many 100 years. So my adult conceptualization of the testimonies derived from Howard Brinton And I have to say that I still have an affinity for that. I don't know if it's just because it seemed authoritative at the time, but it appeals to my concept of simplicity. That is, I felt that what he was doing was just selecting a few principal concepts and then arraying some of our other values, subsumed under those concepts. So for instance, he explains the testimony of harmony, and he doesn't have a separate peace testimony, but he sees the peace principle as subsumed under the testimony of harmony. So I have to say that I like that simplicity. And I also like the conceptual linking of our different beliefs. There's I guess the order of it, the sense of order in it appeals to me. So as the testimonies seem to proliferate, whether it's, trying to fit them into an acronym, which kind of sticks in my craw, or needing to expand them to emphasize them or explain what we're about, I still kind of revert back to, can't we just have a few and understand the others as deriving from them? Like for me, if I have to explain Quakerism to somebody, I say that our fundamental principle is that there's that of God in every person. And all of the testimonies then derive from that. So anyway, I guess what I'm advocating is a conceptual framework that keeps it simple and also helps us understand how our beliefs and values are interrelated.
Other reflections or comments? Yes, Trinette?
Thank you, Jim, for this presentation. I was a little confused when you began because I think someone made, I don't know if it was an error or miscommunication at the 9 a.m. service, a 9 a.m. meeting for worship, and said that you would be speaking on slavery in Maryland, but you're talking about testimonies. One of the things that I was most interested in is the meeting that segregated people of color into different seatings and did not permit them to have the same rights as others within their meetings. How does this reflect on testimony of there is that of God in everyone?
It doesn't. That example from Deer Creek, but it also happened in Philadelphia meetings and elsewhere, reflects a failure of Friends. The phrase "that of God in everyone" is not a phrase that Friends were using in 1787, but instead they would have used phrases like "God is no respecter of persons," or that Jesus gave his life for all people of every nation. To me, what Friends were doing, perhaps in other meetings, but we have a documentation of it at Deer Creek meeting, was allowing worldliness and racial prejudice to corrupt and pervert the heart of who we are as Quakers, our worship. And I would say a couple other things. The early Friends didn't use the term equality, The word in English came to have its meaning in terms of human equality about 100 years after Quakers were founded. But instead, early Friends often spoke about justice and equity and righteousness. And all of those terms, very biblically based, are fresh for us now, and in some ways are more pertinent than the word equality. On your question about Friends and slavery, in January, I made a presentation to Charlottesville meeting about Maryland and Virginia Quakers ceasing to be Quaker enslavers in the period from 1760 to 1800. And I will be giving that presentation again at on the 350th anniversary of George Fox arriving at West River, Maryland. And in part, I'll be giving that presentation there to explain why there's no Quaker meeting at West River. Whereas Deer Creek meeting established so-called Negro benches near the doors. The meeting in West River, Maryland in Anne Arundel County ceased to exist. It was so embedded within the tobacco plantation culture that, in a sense, the place where Friends in our first century as Maryland Quakers had always gone for a yearly meeting, it couldn't adapt and change past the end of slave owning for Quakers. And that meeting died. There's even in my presentation on slavery, shows a friend going to West River in 1810, seeing animals and wild hogs rooting around the Quaker graveyard, seeing Quaker meeting houses turned into tobacco drying barns, and reading from the prophet Jeremiah about the inner moral desolation that had afflicted Quakers and how that was reflected in the outer desolation that he was seeing in Anne Arundel County in the absence of Quakers. So that is an important part of our Baltimore yearly meeting history. And if Trinette, you're from Adelphi meeting, I understand?
No, Sandy Springs.
Sandy Spring. Well, at some point, I'd be happy to come back to Sandy Spring and present just on the topic of that history, because I have a very strong presentation in which I emphasize the role of Black resistance to Quaker slave owning and some of the specific actions that people enslaved by Quakers did to challenge morally Quakers in the 1750s and 60s, and leading to Quakers ceasing to be enslavers. In other words, emphasizing Black agency and not just the efforts of visitors like John Woolman.
Patty, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I apologize that I'm using the tablet that the video camera doesn't work. Jim, thanks, and it's nice to see you again.
Yes, great to see you, Patty.
One of the takeaways from this is that I don't go to worship often enough to let the testimonies flow out of my inward experience. That if I were able to get all of that power or the insight from my inward experience, I mean, all of that comes out in the testimony if I were to get that from my inward experience, I'm not sure I'd ever get out of worship. I mean, 1 hour a week is not enough to be able to hear and absorb and listen and appreciate all of the wisdom and depth that's in the testimonies. So I'm glad it's been recorded in history, and other friends have been able to accumulate the wisdom in the testimonies. But I just want to observe, I need a lot more worship than 1 hour a week. It's kind of startling that when we were in New Zealand, we had worship 3 times a week. And I felt more engaged with our faith and practice and living the testimonies there. But while I'm back at home, I'm too absorbed in my own other stuff. And I think it's just observation that we need more worship to be able to really live up to the heritage that we have.
Thank you, Patty. I'd like to just introduce something which many of you may be familiar with already, and that is 2 concepts of time in the Greek language that informs the New Testament. And the one we usually think of is chronos, which is clock time. But the other one, also, I think more frequently mentioned in the Greek New Testament, is kairos. And kairos is the fullness of time, or the ripeness of time. And in a sense, it's where eternity breaks through into the present. And I feel like in Quaker Testimony, that's very much a part of what we need. We need to not only count the hours in our day or our week, but also experience God's presence in a way that transforms time. And that isn't just in time where we may be individually engaged in spiritual practice or in our community in worship, but in everything we do, in the sense of every act being a prayer, or to quote, also our activity needs to be in the sense of worship, even in the sense that Frederick Douglass used, and he said, I prayed for 20 years, but God didn't reply until I prayed with my legs and in motion. And so in a sense, we need to experience our worship in our activity and as well as in our time in silence or in waiting worship.
I think, Jim, that's why that Mobius strip that you had
Yes.
on that one slide with the internal knowing and the external practice, or the external, I forget, I'd like to look at that again, but that's
Mm-hmm.
a kind of a way of saying the same thing, that there's
Mm-hmm.
theoretically we could get to the place where we're more unified and recognize we're only in one place on the same continuum.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions or reflections, friends? I'm noting that it's 1:03. I'm not needing to leave, but if there are people who need to go, feel free to go, since we've been together an hour. But I'm happy to stay for extended time with all of you. This is quite rich, and I treasure it.
Jim, I have a question.
Yes.
Could you address the subject of integrity and how it has changed, I don't know, in the last 100 or 150 years, culturally and for Quakers, with Quakers?
Yes, thanks. Great question. One of the things to note is that integrity, or other versions of it like truth and equality, was not in the Howard Brinton list in 1940. And he did that because he considered it a personal testimony and not a social or a group testimony. I think he was wrong about that. And another person who thought so was a friend, Wilmer Cooper, whose pamphlet from 1991 about the testimony of integrity, it's a Pendle Hill pamphlet, was quite influential, at least in the United States. And it helped us get the I in what became Spices, that pamphlet. Some people consider, I think Wilmer Cooper and others consider that integrity or truth is the core testimony of all the testimonies. But there's other people who say that about other of the, some people say that's true of the equality testimony. Integrity isn't just an individual thing. It's something that is about our society. It's about our communities. And I just encourage you to look more at the slide I prepared about integrity, and I will send you a set of Quaker quotations about that may help you when you reach that month. But there's a lot more to. I'd also note that in the England, in the Great Britain and Britain yearly meeting, they don't usually say spice or spices. They have a different acronym or a set of acronyms. They'd say sometimes steps, or they even say PES, but they say they don't use the term integrity. They use the word truth that fits into their steps framework, and that idea is influential on in Ireland yearly meeting and in New Zealand yearly meeting. Though interestingly, Australia follows they use the spices term as well as most other places at Brahmala Friends School, some schools in East Africa, Kenya, and other places use the spices term. But for the integrity testimony, the short pamphlet by Wilmer Cooper from 1991 is one that you might choose to buy copies and distribute at Sandy Spring. It's quite important in going deeper into that testimony.
Thank you.
I could say about, well, I will say in early friends, when early friends talked about testimonies in terms of what we did not do instead of what we do, often it focused on oaths and not swearing oaths, not just oaths as witnesses in court, but also oaths of office, a loyalty oath, but also everything we say in our speech was affected. And also the idea of fixed prices and not bargaining in the marketplace, but instead having the same price for everyone, whether they were your friends or a stranger, or whether they were a Native American person you were selling product to, as well as a European person, all with the same prices. that grew out of the integrity testimony as well as one specific application of it.
So Jim, I'm grateful for this brief presentation. I know when we talk, your workshops that you've done at BYM have much more time for us to delve into it, but this has really been helpful to me. I have two ways that I have talked about the testimonies to people and trying to explain what I thought was a broader definition. And I'd like to just run them by you and get your reaction to them. And I think we've had them sometimes in an informal conversation. I've often said that the testimonies are the fruits, and that we need to focus on the roots. What are the roots? And in your presentation and in your slides, you have a lot there that are a root, which I'd like to explore further personally. And then the other phrase is that they are outward manifestations of an inward transformation. So those, I've used those two phrases. What's your reaction to them? What would you, what you've already said, I guess you've already answered in your slides and in your brief presentation, but.
Those ways of explaining testimony are good, but they also emphasize the movement from inward to outward.
Yes.
And I want to say that the movement from outward to inward is equally important. And so when we experience when we undertake actions, say for the integrity of creation that help to restore our earth, whether it's locally or globally, from that we can more fully experience the sacredness of creation, and in some ways, if we're having if we're feeling blocked around one of the testimonies, one of the ways in which we might move beyond that block is by practicing it outwardly as a way to more deeply experience it inwardly. But these aren't things we all have to do individually. Another thing that is very meaningful to me about Quaker community is knowing that there are other friends focused on an area, so it frees me to focus on something else. So if I know in my meeting that there are friends nurturing and growing the community, then that may allow me to give more focus to pursuing justice, and the same way those friends focused on the community. I mean, not that those two things are separate, but that's a lot of what our committees and our ad hoc efforts as well allow us to do, is to over the course of our lives focus in different areas of the testimonies and within the breadth of our communities as well. But the inward aspect is crucial so that we don't burn out in our outward actions. Yet inward piety or something in and of itself is quite barren if it's not expressed in outward practice.
I think that's a takeaway for me, your Mobius strip.
Okay.
A big takeaway.
Well, you'll have a copy of it. I'll send this to Joan, and she can distribute it, these 30 slides, as a as a reference for you in the next months.
And then we have to figure out how we distribute it. That'll be our challenge here.
Yeah.
Get it to a wider audience.
Well, I prepared this specifically for your monthly meeting, so I'm not interested in distributing it beyond Sandy Spring at this time. But yes, please, everyone in the Sandy Spring community.
So beyond, you don't want it beyond Sandy Spring. Okay, so just keep.
Well, not at this time.
It'll be a
At
challenge.
some point,
to
I
get
may
it-
have a, yeah. Are there other reflections or questions? There's people we haven't heard from yet. I'd love to hear from some of those voices.
Jim, I join, of course, with Patty on missing your visits, which hopefully we can do soon. We're over in the former Garrettson household behind the museum, so it's easy for you to find again. I am absolutely fascinated with the perspective that you've laid out for us, and I'm very drawn to it. I've actually learned how to take screenshots with my iMac here, and so I'm going to send some of those to around to folks to what we can focus on. And I'm quite interested to learning what the next steps are, because it's been mentioned by both Joan and you that this is a part of a continuing series. So I'd be interested to hear what that would look like.
So I think I can speak to that. We are planning in our meeting for learnings over the next couple of months to have different friends come and do a presentation about how they have experienced that testimony in their life and their work. And that will go through June, right, George? I think, and yeah, through June. So each month we will have a different friend come and present to us at a meeting for learning in the same format that we're doing today. And I think what we would like to do is have Jim's information as the background, kind of the foundation for all of those that are coming in the future. So we'll figure that out.
I just want to say, as you focus individually on the testimonies, I really just want to emphasize how important it is to see them as one whole and not a menu that we can choose from, but they're all part of one testimony. And furthermore, I remember in March 2019 at Annapolis meeting, we were having interim meeting, and we were discussing the rights of a proposed minute on the rights of transgender people in the US military. And a friend stood and spoke about that he perceived that this minute reflected an example of where our equality testimony and our peace testimony were in conflict with each other. And in that meeting, I was moved to speak out of the silence on that minute, where I said that if it seems to us that two of our testimonies are not consistent with each other or not in conflict with each other, that's a reason to go inward and to look more deeply at what each of those testimonies are, because as inward truth, they're not in conflict with each other. And that minute was approved after a little while after I spoke, but they're all part of a whole. testimony that is the Quaker testimony to ourselves and to our communities and to the world.
Thank you, Jim. I think we're going to have to wrap up at
Yeah.
this point. But I look forward to getting your slides, and then we're going to figure out how we're going to carry them forward over the next few months among friends here at Sandy Spring. And maybe we'll even invite you to come back on that other topic that Tronette thought that she was coming to hear about.
Yes. I'm sorry.
I don't know how that got miscommunicated, but
Well, I've also presented not just on Friends and the end of Quaker slave holding in January, but 2 weeks ago at Homewood meeting in Maryland, I presented on Quakers and anti-lynching. And it was a much broader historical topic than just Baltimore Yearly Meeting history, but looked at it looked broadly at Quaker engagement with lynching. And I didn't think I would find as much as I did. I found 4 different yearly meetings taking actions about lynching, but those were dispersed geographically and over time. And I could say that there was no critical mass of Quaker engagement against lynching, but there were important efforts, and that's what I talked about in that talk. I don't know how many sessions you're planning, but I do hope you plan a session on the Quaker testimony of justice.
okay, we will take that.
If you need me to present in that one or to share things, I'd be happy to do that, though I'm sure there's other people who would be good at that as well.
Thank you. That's helpful. So Barb, as you know, Barb is putting this together and under ministering counsel. So we'll take that under advisement. We're hoping that this experiment of meetings for learning will continue in the future. I want to say on behalf of Sandy Spring, our great gratitude for your taking the time to put this together for us and to take the time today. And we will hold you in the light of prayer in your work out at Earlham ESR in Indiana for what you are doing for our Quaker community, what you are bringing, what you are learning and bringing to the rest of us.
Thank you, Joan.
So our blessings to you in that endeavor.
I learned as much from Baltimore Yearly Meeting friends as I do from ESR classmates.
Okay.
We have and I'm still very active on 3 different yearly meeting committees and working groups.
Including intervisitation, as we did
Yes.
last week.
Well, and that's why, Jim, you keep learning because you're one of us. So thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Bye, friends.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.